Today we're going to do a deep dive into what the best emergency DPS weapon is, covering mostly exotic primaries like Outbreak and Touch of Malice, but if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to talk about a bonus option you've probably never heard of. But first, I've made a Discord now, so if you fancy helping out with videos or interacting with me on a closer level, go ahead and join up because we're trying to hit 1,000 members before the final shape showcase. Thank you. Okay, so just to preface, emergency DPS situations are typically very short in time, because as the name suggests, they happen at a critical point in the DPS phase, either when you have completely run out of ammo or are totally out of time. So knowing this, I'm going to conduct all of my testing in this video on the Templar, since a no TP damage phase lasts exactly 12 seconds, which is short enough to simulate a real emergency situation. So, starting things off with a classic, Outbreak Perfected. In the available 12 seconds, Outbreak hits for 198k, giving it an emergency DPS of 16,500. Keep in mind though, Outbreak is best used in a situation where everyone else in your group is also using it, since this will allow the nanites to stack on the target way faster. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so it's like a difference of like 50k. Overall, having 6 Outbreaks improves the DPS by about 25%, so not bad at all. Moving on to Touch of Malice, which hits for 316,000 in the available 12 seconds, giving it a DPS of 26,364, which is pretty decent and may actually improve once the weapon receives its buffs. Continuing the Weapons of Sorrow trend, Osteo Striga deals 252,000 damage in the available time, giving a nice 21,000 DPS. Next, we've got Malfeasance with Lucky Pants, hitting for 583,000, giving it a DPS of 48,583. Pretty high as expected, and actually would be even higher since in a typical raid group there's always someone running with a horde. Moving on to a very popular weapon, Quicksilver Storm with the reload tech, hitting for 295,000 damage, giving a DPS of 24,583. And just for a laugh, an Actium Warrig boosted Sweet Business comes out at 25,167 DPS. I initially decided not to include Final Warning as I thought it would be average, but I was in fact very surprised at the 414,000 damage it dealt, giving a very nice 34,500 DPS. Now for the last of the kinetic options, Revision 0 with Vorpal and 4th times Charm, coming out at 27,390 DPS. Very solid, but unfortunately it takes a little while to reach 4 times telemetry data, which I guess you could pre-prepare, but that goes against the point of this being an emergency option. Now onto the energy weapons, starting with a newly buffed Graviton Lance, which comes out at a surprisingly bad 16,200 DPS. I honestly expected more. By popular request from the Discord, next up is Tarrabah, coming in at a woeful 14,436 DPS, the lowest so far. Now we're going to test Skyburner's Oath, Tommy's Matchbook, and Polaris Lance, all of which recently received Scorch and Ignition synergy. So starting with Skyburner's, which hits for 12,750 DPS, Tommy's at a very surprising 29,416 DPS, and then Polaris at a mid 16,400 DPS. Next, I wanted to quickly touch on Symmetry, as in my opinion it's such a cool weapon, but unfortunately it only achieves a DPS of 18,701, so back to the vault it goes. And finally, the last energy weapon, Hierarchy of Needs, coming out at 14,324 DPS, though unfortunately it requires too much faffing about to create the ring, so not an optimal pick in my opinion. Nah, that just takes an eternity to set up. So here are the results of all of the testing, with Final Warning being the best standalone pick. Take a screenshot or note down the best options if you wish. As promised, we're now going to cover the bonus option, which I'm sure you haven't even considered, that being the Supremacy with rewind rounds and 4th times a charm. As expected, with it being a special weapon, the Supremacy hits for the highest DPS at 56,539. Very nice. You might be thinking though, isn't the whole point of an emergency DPS weapon it being a primary and not a special? And about a year ago, you would be right, but these days it's virtually impossible to run out of special ammo with how easy it is to get armor charge and spam special finishers, meaning it's not at all impractical to use a special like the Supremacy for emergency DPS. This argument raises yet another question though. If special ammo is so easy to come by, why use a primary weapon for emergency DPS at all? Why use the Supremacy when there are probably several other special weapons which deal more DPS? Well, to answer the first question, people don't typically associate special weapons with emergency DPS, rather just regular DPS, so it's still worth knowing which primary weapon deals the most emergency DPS for those do or die situations. But honestly, with how strong our characters are in general these days compared to something like Day 1 Vow of the Disciple, emergency DPS situations become increasingly rarer, and as for why you might use the Supremacy over other specials, it's simply because it has essentially infinite ammo, which in my view is a good enough trade-off for losing a damage perk. But, as with all these divisive topics, I'll leave you to be the judge, dear viewer. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, consider subscribing as I'm trying to hit 10k subs by October. Bye for now, dear viewer.